You always get positive marks for a speech if you give people a chance to talk about themselves. It's one of our favorite topics. Why have we been talking about ourselves? Because this is the ground in which the seed of God's Word has been planted. Or as the medievals said, grace builds on nature. God's Spirit at work within us has only got the stuff each of us has been talking about to work with. If we're going to grow spiritually, it's because this is the stuff that the Spirit has to work with and that we have to work with. The gifts, the talents, the failures, the losses, the successes, the stuff of our lives is the reality that the Spirit must work with to bring us fully alive. Which is why, in the center of that chart, is that whole central section, which starts with spiritual, moves to religious, then to Christian, then to Catholic. It is interesting. For some reason, God sends us groups of people. 2 years ago, the group headed towards Christian initiation at Easter Vigil was a younger group. All but one of those people was driven by the desire for affective conversion. Some of them deeply so. At least one of them had attempted suicide at one point and yearned for some deep knowledge that would make her really believe that she was loved and worthwhile. Now that was extreme. But the other ones all were coming through that door, that part of the outer circle, into that center circle, through that door. Whereas the group that was initiated, they were all candidates. They were all already baptized who were becoming Catholics. The February ones were intellectual. They were thinking their way into the Catholic community. They were looking at history and theology and things like that and thinking their way into it. This last spring's was more about moral conversion. These were people who wanted to get their lives to embody their values. Not for a couple of them, I thought it was they were looking for a new set of values. The one they had from the world had not led them to being fully alive, and they were looking for another set. For a couple other, it seemed to me, they already had Jesus's values. They were trying to put them into action. But that's why I went around the whole outside, because each of us enters that center from our own personal point. What needs in the next 6 weeks to begin to change in you if on Easter Day you are to be fully alive? Which door are you going to enter through? And no, we're not going to talk about that. That's one of your homework assignments. But is that question making sense to you? Because it's intensely personal and truly unique. And before we get to talk more about the center, what really intrigued me about this the first time I saw Don write about this and then speak about this was when an insight he had that incomplete conversion usually happens because one of the triad is out of balance. For instance, if you're emotionally and intellectually converted, you really believe in Jesus. You feel that deeply, and you really love him. But your life doesn't show that. You're a hypocrite. And if you're intellectually converted and morally converted, you know about Jesus, and you might even know Jesus. Your life might reflect his values even, but you're not affectively converted. Then you can be caught in a real trap. You're kind of as he sometimes said, you're a born Catholic. You'll follow all the rules, but there's no creativity to it. There's no joy to it. There's no empathy to it. A lot of what we're coming out of in the church, I epitomize this, and I'll use the name because he's gone from the Supreme Court of the Vatican, is Cardinal Burke. Every time I heard the man speak or something he'd written, it was very clear to me that he was a canon lawyer. And he wanted this book with all the truths of Christianity, of Catholicism in it. And I'll say yes to the book, like geometry. And then these are the rules I'll follow. And if you're not in that group, you're in the out group, and you're going to pay for it. There are people out there like that, aren't there? It's a nice place to live because, among other things, you don't have to take responsibility for anything. And it's often driven by guilt. And frankly, there are fewer, less productive experiences than guilt. Because guilt usually leaves me in charge. Whereas forgiveness, openness to compassion and love leads to joy. And joy is not about me. Joy is about us. The hypocrite, the born something or other. I like to point out too at that point, we do not, when we profess the creed, say, I believe that there is one God. We say, I believe in one God. How would you paraphrase that? I put my trust in. I entrust myself to. I even commit myself to. Because this God has committed their very self to me. Which is why when we baptize, that's the question we ask them. Will you make this commitment? Will you trust? And if they say yes, we throw them in the water. But it's not geometry. The creed is not a set of axioms and syllogisms. The creed is a statement of relationships. It's the closest thing, the closest analogy to it I would make is marriage. Because what the marriage vows say is, I believe in you, and this is a gamble, but better or worse, here we go. And that is the world that a person who turns away from affective conversion loses. His third comment was, what happens when you got someone who's emotionally and morally converted, but not intellectually? And there, what he called them was the fundamentalist. It was like the op-ed piece of mine that appeared in the Enquirer in December when I was writing about the unfortunate suicide of Leila Alcorn. And I said the first thing that disturbed me was that except for one Episcopal priest, none of the clergy had written anything. When all that kept getting reported was her mother's statement that God does not make mistakes. These were his chromosomes, therefore she had to be a boy, and God does not make mistakes. Now that's the theological statement, and one Episcopal priest wrote a letter about it. So I figured, well, somebody should. And what I pointed out was, it was actually a movie, I wasn't in the church, but this fundamentalist minister is preaching. And when Jesus left us, he left us a book. And I sat there in the theater and thought exactly what I wrote in the letter. You know, if you read the book, you'd realize Jesus didn't leave us a book. He left us the Spirit and the church. And when those two work together, in the long run, we'll get it right. Sometimes it's a pretty long run. But that's where we are. And the prime example of that is precisely how many centuries it took for us to decide what was even going to be in the book. What I find most amusing is that the Christian Old Testament is bigger than the Jewish Old Testament. But you can't just say, as the bumper stickers say, God said it, I believe it, and that's the way it is. And as I continued in that op-ed piece, I cited precisely the part of Acts which I think we have ignored at our peril. When Peter is being called on the carpet in Jerusalem for baptizing Gentiles without turning them into Jews first, he says, God gave them exactly the same thing he gave us in the beginning. By the way, what was it that God gave them in the beginning? The Spirit. They got the Spirit just like we did, without keeping the law. And who was I to stand in God's way? And we do a lot of times with our refusal to get out of our stereotypes, get out of our preconceptions, listen to the amazingly new things that the world of science, psychology, sociology is discovering about what it means to be human. And just keep insisting upon, well, this was the way it was. Well, be careful. You will find yourself standing in God's way. As Gamaliel says, when they're talking about in the Sanhedrin what to do with the apostles who are preaching in the name of Jesus, he says, just give it a while. Give it a while. If it's not from God, it'll go away. If it is from God, then stand back. The hypocrite, the born Catholic, the fundamentalist. Being fully alive is not necessarily easy, is it? Because you have to be responsible for your thoughts, your actions, and your feelings in a mature way. But the Spirit, what's in the center of that? And that's me, that's not Don. Those 4 circles in the middle are what I brought to what he was talking about. And I put as the smallest circle the spiritual. And I think in this age where people said they are spiritual but not religious, which is a phrase we could need to ponder, but I can put a face to it. About 4 weeks ago now, on a Monday, I got up, checked the email, and there was an email from a student of mine who graduated in 1984, whom I ran into 20 years ago, hadn't seen since, but I'm on Facebook, and it turns out that he was in his 3rd year of brain cancer, and he had written a memoir about this. The first part kind of explaining his origins, and the second part being a compendium of the Facebook posts that he put up over the last 2 years as he's been dealing with the disease. It was a very moving and he asked my help because the publisher he had, as he said, provided him with a, so to speak, sort of proofreader, but not an editor. 44 years of reading high school essays. This is a no-brainer. So he emailed it to me, and I read it the next day. It took me about 3.5 hours. It's 161 pages, but there are a number of photographs in it. And it was very moving because he failed out of Miami, but got married, and they went off and lived on the coast of Oregon in a yurt. Anybody know what a yurt is? And had 2 boys, and when the 3rd one came, they decided that the 30-foot square yurt was not going to work for 5 people. So they moved back to Oxford, and that was time for the kids to go to school and things. And then his first wife died of breast cancer, so he did what my father did too, which was he married the woman that my mother told him to marry. So his second wife was the woman, his first wife. I just said that to somebody yesterday who said, "Oh yeah, my father did the same thing." This is a part of being a woman I was unaware of. Men won't do that, I think. But women evidently do this, okay. I guess you know us better than anybody else, so. So there it is. And then 3 years ago, he got brain cancer. It was very moving to read. And he is a deeply spiritual person who has actually taught Tai Chi, is a very loving, he must be an amazing father, is an amazing, loving human being, and he is nothing but spiritual. The closest thing he comes to any conception of God is the wind. And fine. He's a deeply moral, emotional, and thoughtful person. Most people, though, I always like to say, those who wish to be spiritual but not religious want the soul without the body. And human beings don't come that way. And in the work I did with the Labyrinth 15 years ago, it was the name Lauren Artris familiar to anyone? She was one of the big people in the labyrinth movement in this country. She always said, find a tradition. Those of you who think you can do your spiritual life on your own are fooling yourselves. Everybody needs a community of some kind. And I think the movement into religion usually comes when the spirit gets a body, when it becomes a group of people who are pursuing this common goal of spiritual growth and development. And God works through that in all kinds of ways. And Vatican II told us we had to respect that and rejoice that God was at work. Now, Joe, the guy I described, his emails are getting more and more erratic and misspelled. But that's what God wanted to do with him. Should I preach the word to him? No. God had shaped it and molded him, and for me to say anything Christian to him would be getting, in my opinion, in God's way. So, where do you move, though, from being religious, because there are many religions, to being Christian? It's precisely as the name says, because you establish a relationship with Jesus. And that moves. When we accept a catechumen, when we make a catechumen, if you listen to the questions Dan asked them, do you turn to Christ? I turn to Christ. Do you accept Christ as your teacher? I accept Christ. Will you follow Christ? I will follow Christ. Turn, convert, accept as teacher, intellectual, moral. Will you follow Christ? Affective, moral. That makes you a disciple, a pupil of Jesus. That's how you become a catechumen. But it doesn't get you to the font and the chrism and the table. You have to become a Christian to do that. And to do that, you have to move from being a disciple of Jesus to being a believer in Jesus. It was Nathan Mitchell who pointed out that the resurrection accounts in all the four Gospels are descriptions of people who are moving from being disciples, pupils of Jesus, to being believers in Jesus as Lord. It's why Mark is so funny, because in the original ending, they fail at the task. The original ending, the women run away from the tomb and don't tell anybody anything. So much for the attempt to empower apostles to change the world. That's what gets you out of religious and into Christian. Following, being a disciple of Jesus starts it. Putting your trust in Jesus as Lord continues it. What gets you across into Catholic? Precisely your awareness that you want to buy the whole thing. Because the name means something. To be Catholic is to be small c Catholic. Everybody, every believing Christian from the first century to now somehow has something to tell us. And who was it who said, the Catholic Church means here comes everybody. And as Francis is reteaching us after this period when we thought that some people thought that Catholicism was geometry plus rule living, he's teaching us we got to listen to everybody. The technical term for what Protestants do is they enter into the full communion of the Catholic Church. And God knows, is there a family that doesn't have fights? But you work your way through it. That's how you stay a family. So, your homework is to think about which doorway is yours. But right now, I want you to ask yourself this question and share. Where on that continuum, from spiritual to religious to Christian to Catholic, would you put yourself right now? Where do you feel comfortable? There are no right or wrong answers, just honest ones.